believe that John Lansman is probably on his way, but we're going to get going anyway. I'm now delighted to hand over to Heather Stewart, who will chair the event. Heather.
Hello and welcome. I was just reminding myself what the title of the event is, which is What Will Be the Outcome of Brexit? Which is a perfectly simple question that I'm sure we can all answer very comprehensively in the next hour and a half. So we've got an excellent panel, even more excellent if John Lansman arrives, but even in John's absence, we've got an excellent panel to discuss this issue. We have the Shadow Chancellor, promoting it. The Shadow, it's been a very long conference.
I've been shuffled.
It's been, yeah, without you. I've just had a message just to say that you've known. It's been the Shadow Brexit Secretary, Keir Starmer, Yvette Cooper, who's Chair of the Home Affairs Select Committee, of course, and Hilary Benn, Chair of the Brexit Select Committee. So, Keir, shall we let you go first? I know you've already done a comprehensive turn on the conference floor today, but why don't you start and set out for us some of the issues in the next weeks and months?
Let me see if I can do that, with the caveat that, in truth, nobody really knows what's going to happen in the next few weeks and months, and anybody who pretends that they do is not being entirely truthful. So what I'll try and do in the time we've got, before we get to questions, which is always the better time, is just sort of say, where are we now? How do we get here? And how do we get out of here, if it's possible to get out of here? I mean, where are we now? We are 23 days to the next EU summit. And that was the summit, the October summit, at which we were supposed to have agreed the Article 50 deal, and then for that to come back to Parliament to be voted on, and then to go to the European Parliament to be voted on, and the EU withdrawal implementation bill would start its passage through Parliament. Looking at the fallout from Salzburg, it's obvious to everybody that we're a long way from that, and therefore there's talk of the November summit. How do we get to this position where there's still a gap between the EU and the UK that looks unbridgeable with literally days to go? And I think the tracing back is really to the red lines that the Prime Minister set out in October 2016. Everybody will always remember her 2017 conference speech where she was handed a P45, had a bad throat, and the stage collapsed, all of which actually weren't the Prime Minister's fault. And, you know, for all the smiling at it, I thought, you know, there but for the grace of God, go us one day. But it was the 2016 speech where she said, my interpretation of the referendum result is out of the single market, out of the customs union, no governance in terms of courts or anything like that, no agencies, and adding a little bit about citizens from nowhere. That was the interpretation, which I thought was extreme. I thought there were plenty of other interpretations of the outcome that could have been put forward. A different Prime Minister, I think, might have said, we've had an outcome, we must respect the result, but it was close, and it was different across different regions and different countries. And therefore, I'm not ruling anything out. I'm going to keep all my options on the table, and I'm going to try and craft a future relationship which respects the fact that we will be a third party, but also the fact that, broadly speaking, half the country voted the other way. And I think if she'd done that, we'd have set off down an entirely different path. And if she'd been really smart, she might have thought, given we've been fighting in my party over Europe for 40 years, I might face some problems. And therefore I'd be wise to get Parliament as a whole behind me by putting some of this to Parliament in the first place so that we could all have a say on the objectives. So the starting point for the problem we're in were those red lines. Obviously, Chequers was an attempt to sort of get out of that position, to get the Prime Minister out of the corner she'd painted herself into. But she couldn't go very far without her own party then trying to shoot her down. So she took some gentle steps towards a more sensible arrangement, quite a lot of stuff on security that people thought was perfectly sensible, and something that accommodated the need for some sort of customs arrangement and some sort of single rule book for goods. But she's in an impossible position because the EU has said repeatedly, we don't accept the main planks of that. And I was really surprised that the Prime Minister was surprised last week that they said that, because I've been rolling news for weeks. So it's not acceptable, at least the key planks, to the EU, and it won't be voted through by our own party. So you've got this slightly unreal situation, which is there's a gap between us and the EU. That's not unusual in negotiations. There's always a gap to be closed in the last few days and weeks. But what usually happens in any negotiations is that both parties are able to start bridging that gap, moving towards each other with a sort of, we'll go to there if you'll come this far. And then, you know, midnight or at the 11th hour and all the rest of it, something is pulled off. But the Prime Minister doesn't have the authority to take the next necessary step. Because if she tries to go one step beyond Chequers, then her own party will take her out and challenge her leadership. So in an ordinary situation, a Prime Minister would at least have her own team behind her. And all the focus this week on, you know, us and the opposition and what are you going to do is all well and good. But actually, in a rational world, a Prime Minister would say, I don't really care what the opposition are going to do. I've got my own party, I've got my own majority, and I've got the authority to go forward. So we're in a really unusual situation. So therefore, you know, what will happen and where do we go from here? And what I was trying to lay out this morning is the sequence of decisions that I think are going to have to be made and the positions that we, the Labour Party, will adopt at each of those steps. I'm acutely aware that we are dealing with the unknown. We don't actually know quite what's going to happen or when it's going to happen. But obviously the first thing we expect to happen is, if there is a deal, that the Prime Minister will have to bring it back to Parliament to have it voted on. And there's legislation that requires her to have a vote on the deal. So assuming she does agree something, it comes back for a vote. And our position, as it's actually been from the beginning of the process, is we'll subject that deal to the 6 tests we set out at the beginning. And if it doesn't meet those tests, we will vote against it. Now, those tests were set out when the Prime Minister started the exercise. We said, this is what we will hold you to. And they were based on commitments that she and her government made about what they were going to achieve. And when I issued the test, the Prime Minister's response, when it was put to her, was, I'm determined to meet those tests. It's obviously gone pretty hopelessly wrong since then. But I think the pressure now on us to sort of somehow dilute our tests so that she can get over the hurdle is a bit rich. Well, since I'm having a bad time, I'm really doing, making a bad job of this. Could you just lower your tests a bit so I can leap over them? So we will apply our tests and vote against it if it doesn't meet our tests. The deal may go through or not go through, depending on her own party. It only doesn't go through if her own party votes against her, or at least some of them do. But if it does fall, or she can't reach an agreement, then I do think the next step should be a call for a general election. And but for the fixed-term Parliament, that would be the obvious in-principle thing that would happen. Because the convention before the Fixed-Term Parliament Act was if you had a crisis vote, and this would be a crisis vote, and you didn't survive, you went to the country. And frankly, if the Prime Minister spent 2 years negotiating and failed in the most important negotiations since the Second World War, she ought to go to the country. But then the other thing that I was setting out this morning is assume the deal doesn't go through, assume then there's not a general election, so we're now sort of 3 steps down the road. What then do we do effectively to protect ourselves from no deal? And at that stage, other options are going to have to come into play, one of which is a public vote. Now, the immediate next question is, well, what's the question, how are you going to frame it, etc., etc. The answer to that is we'll have to take some of these decisions when we get there, because there are unknowns in this. Is there a deal that could be picked over? Is there not a deal that could be picked over? And of course, we would still be in opposition, so it would depend what other people in the House of Commons thought about what the next step should be. But what we made clear this morning is that the options must include a public vote. And so what I was trying to do is set out what may happen over the next few weeks and months and what our proposed position as a party would be as we go through each of those decisions. But as I go back to where I started, I genuinely think if you went out there into the streets and bars and cafes of Liverpool or any city or place across the UK and said to anybody, what do you think is going to happen? Most people would say, I haven't got a clue. And that would be a very honest answer. Thank you.
Hilary, would you like to go next?
Yes, sure. Well, Heather, thank you very much indeed. And can I thank the Centre for European Reform for the work that you do. And Charles, the intelligence that you demonstrate and feed back to us about what other people are feeling about the process. Look, let's be frank, it's a mess. And Keir set out very clearly, and in a wonderful speech this morning, why it is a mess. 2 years the Cabinet arguing amongst themselves. Finally, the Prime Minister decided to take a position, and she was in the end persuaded that we need tariff and friction-free trade, and concocted this really complex arrangement because she was trying to keep to her red lines, although she was in the process of painting a number of them pink. It was a political deal as well as an economic proposal, but it suffers from the fundamental flaw at its heart, that the facilitated customs arrangement, the customs deal and the common rule book are not acceptable to the European Union, and Keir's absolutely right, because Michel Barnier told us that when we met him on the 3rd of September in Brussels. He went on the record, and therefore the news that it was unacceptable could absolutely not have come as a surprise to the Prime Minister, even though the tone in which that rejection was delivered probably did. And as a result, she has boxed herself into a corner. And we said in our most recent Select Committee report, if that EU position holds, then the government's going to have to come up with an alternative plan. It's crystal clear, I think, to all of us, there is not an alternative plan. Indeed, the Prime Minister announced before Salzburg that she didn't have another plan. It's this or nothing. Now, nothing is no deal, and we all know what the consequences of that are going to be. And I welcome, amongst many things in the resolution today, very clear instruction to Labour MPs. Under no circumstances are you to vote for anything that results in no deal. There is not a majority in the House of Commons for that, and it will not happen. But you then got the EU saying to the UK, well, there are two options. Over here's Canada. The first time we met Michel Barnier, he said, we can do you a Canada Dry deal, which shows he has got a sense of humour. I'm reliably informed that Canada Dry is still manufactured.
It's a bit retro.
Is that correct? On the one hand, now a Canada deal, well, is no good, because a Canada deal does not give you friction-free trade. And those lorries coming off the ferries in Dover, we went as a Select Committee to look and see, and it's like a continuous train set. Up the ramp, down, off, up the M20. These are the arteries, the lifeblood of a lot of manufacturing industry, because they are delivering goods, including to just-in-time suppliers. So it doesn't work on that front, and secondly, it doesn't solve the problem of the Northern Ireland border. Over here is the other option, which is a customs union, which is our policy, and in effect, EEA, which Keir's absolutely right, the EU hasn't talked about because they've said, well, that's not in line with the government's red lines. But I think, given the choice between those two options, it's quite clear where we must and should be. Now, what do I think is the consequence of where we've ended up? I think there's a real risk we will see a very vague political declaration. Remember, there are two parts to the process: divorce, negotiating the future partnership. We're talking about the first bit now, the withdrawal agreement. It has 4 elements: money, sorted; citizens, sorted, although there is an issue of confidence, as Yvette knows better than anyone else, on the part of the EU citizens, especially given Windrush, about how the Home Office is going to operate and apply the settled status application process, and what it will do about people who don't get round to applying for a variety of reasons by the time that the deadline has been reached. The third part is the transitional arrangement. It's not an implementation period. The Prime Minister still refers to it as an implementation period because there's nothing to implement during it. We need it to then negotiate the future partnership. And by the way, we won't do that by December 2020 and have it ratified, not just by the European Parliament and the Council. The elements of a future partnership that become mixed agreements in the jargon have to be ratified by every single parliament of the European Union and the regional parliaments, including the Parliament of Wallonia, that famously held up the CETA deal for 3 and a bit weeks. And therefore, we're going to have to prolong the transition, or we're going to have to go camp in another place. EEA plus a customs union might well be where we have to end up, because if we don't do that, we fall off the cliff a bit later than next March. We fall off the cliff on the 1st of January 2021. That is absolutely clear. But the thing that is standing in the way of a withdrawal agreement is the Northern Ireland backstop. because that you have to have. You can have a vague declaration, although Parliament will look at that and say, are you serious? You're telling us nothing about what our future economic relationship with our biggest, nearest and most important trading partners is going to be, and you want us to vote for this? But it's a Northern Ireland backstop. And on that front, I have to say, the EU is going to need to move. Because it is quite clear, Parliament will not accept, the Select Committee won't accept, we won't accept, dividing the United Kingdom into two bits, separating off Northern Ireland, which is the current wording in the draft withdrawal agreement. Now, we understand why the EU says it can't cover the whole of the UK because you clever so-and-sos are trying to preempt the negotiation on the future partnership, because remember, a legally enforceable fallback will kick in on the 1st of January 2021 if we have not by that date negotiated a future partnership which produces the same effect for Northern Ireland, the continuation of an open border. So it could apply for some time. The government hasn't helped because it's offered half a fallback, recognising in the document it published in June, we need to add something on regulation. I think part of the tension in Salzburg was that when the Prime Minister met Leo Varadkar, she appeared to say to him, and we're not sure the other bit of our fallback proposal will be ready before the October Council. And you can imagine why people would say, for crying out loud, you've had long enough to think about it. And given that the government has offered alignment with regulations on goods in the Chequers proposal, for the life of me, I can't understand why they haven't put that forward. I still think in the end there will be a deal, because it would be really irrational for both parties to see the whole thing fall down over the question of the backstop. It will take the best minds to try and create something, but the big question is, will Parliament vote for it? And as it stands at the moment, we won't. Will the government pay attention to a majority in Parliament that says you need to do something different? But we're in this mess, as Keir said absolutely correctly. The Prime Minister created red lines that are going to damage our economy, one way or another, and in the end, an economy that is damaged, less strong, less investment, less job opportunities, less tax revenue, we're going to find it much more difficult to address many of the reasons for why people voted for Brexit, because we will have damaged our ability to do so.
Yvette.
So the starting question, what do you think will happen on Brexit? I feel like every single scenario I look at feels highly unlikely and completely implausible, and yet something has to happen. And that is the difficulty with all of this. You almost kind of couldn't have imagined we could have got to here. And the sort of candid decisions that Theresa May seems to have made at every stage in the process to have got to this extremely difficult position. We, I think, probably, between the three of us on the panel, probably have quite a lot of agreement on a lot of the issues. So I'll try and sort of pick out some of the things, some additional points on this. I think, first of all, I would agree with Hilary that I think no deal is not the most likely option. However, it is disturbingly more plausible than I would like it to be, given how damaging it would be to the entire country and to our future. And, you know, even today, Theresa May seems to be almost trying to block herself in even further by saying that or implying that a Canada option is worse than no deal. And the idea that sort of anything could be worse than no deal seems to me to just be in denial about the scale of the problem. Hilary talked about the consequences would be for, for the 17-mile queues at the border, the implications for trade, for our manufacturing industry, on which so many of our jobs and so many communities depend. The consequences, all extremely serious consequences for our NHS. The idea that we could be talking in the middle of the 21st century of stockpiling medicines. It just feels unthinkable. But just to say something about what it would mean on security issues, because no deal means we have no legal basis for our criminal and policing cooperation. That's not something you can just fudge.
because it means you just can't get cases through court. If you have no legal basis on which to arrest people, no legal basis on which to share criminal information, then you have no legal basis on which to arrest somebody, to take them to court, to put that evidence to court, and to convict dangerous people of crimes. We also would immediately lose access to the SIS2 database, and we heard from Rob Wainwright, that is the database that we get access to, our border officials get access to on any kind of alerts or concerns about other European citizens who might be entering the country. For example, and Rob Wainwright, who was the former director of Europol, said, for example, a wanted sex offender, let's suppose, from Spain or from the Czech Republic, somebody trying to get into the country. At the moment, our border force has access to that information and can stop someone at the border. We wouldn't have that information. So how on earth is any of that taking back control of our borders? How on earth is any of that taking back control? It sounds an awful lot more like losing control. And so I don't think we should underestimate quite how serious the no-deal scenario is. I also think the most likely scenario at the moment is a blind Brexit. And I think this is the second worst option after no deal, because the risk is that is simply no deal 2 years' time. And the reason I think a blind Brexit is particularly troubling is because you also lose some of the negotiating cards that you have at the moment. And so if you simply just take whatever you want as your final outcome to be out of any of this, if you just take a patriotic view about, well, we've got to get something that's in the interests of the country, you don't put ourselves in a position where we have no negotiating cards, where we are effectively vulnerable to whatever it is that the EU wants to give us, or the no-deal scenario that we've already agreed is so damaging. And so I think the idea, this is the thing I'm most worried about, though, because I think there will be an incentive on Theresa May to try and, in order to cobble together a coalition among her own party around this, is to just come up with something that is dishonest and something which promises everybody that this final deal, the final arrangement, is going to be whatever it is they want it to be, or whatever it is that they can hope for, but actually there's nothing agreed about what happens next at all. And the other thing I think to be aware of with all of this is, look, there is a section of the Conservative Party for whom this is so ideological. This is driven by a sort of wider view of rolling back the state, rolling back any sense of regulations and standards, of wanting to be part of a free trade arrangement and bloc with the US with much lower standards, rather than a free trade bloc with the EU with higher standards, or effectively a trading bloc with the EU with higher standards. And it was significant, the things that Sajid Javid is supposed to have said in some of the cabinet discussions about this, about he would, if ended up facing no deal, blind deal, I think, will end up being no deal. If you end up in that situation, that you can have a shock and awe strategy, and those are the words that were briefed, talking about huge cuts in tax, huge cuts in regulation, including huge cuts in environmental regulation, and gratuitously thrown in there, and you kind of think, where did that one come from? Getting rid of automatic enrolment for pensions. So suddenly pensions are at risk on that kind of right-wing strategy for this. So I think that, therefore, huge risks. Czech, as we know, is unpopular within the Conservative Party and with the EU, and from our point of view, I think should fail the manufacturing test. Doesn't include a customs union, has this unworkable customs partnership for our manufacturing. I go back to Yorkshire manufacturing. If I talk too long, I'll start talking about Haribo again in my constituency, which is always my favoured example and favoured place to visit, because they are so nice at letting me help with the quality control testing. But then the other question is, could you put together some form of customs union and EEA style approach that doesn't necessarily need to be the existing EEA framework, question about whether there's versions of something that looks similar to the EEA, either as a sort of backstop, the next thing that you move to, or as something that's a longer term objective. And we on the Select Committee came up with the evidence that we took, actually a range of reforms that you could do to free movement, even within an EEA style framework. And I do think there is a problem that the MAC, the Migration Advisory Committee, only appears to have looked at effectively the options for immigration reform that go down a Canada track, rather than looking at a whole range of options for immigration reform, including ones that stay either much closer to or within a single market and have it as part of the negotiations as well. Obviously, there's then a question about what happens next, and I think Keir is right. Everything has to be on the table, and we genuinely have no idea what the dynamics will be in Parliament, what the situation will be in terms of, what the EU view will be, what's the nearest kind of deal that they might have got to, not got to, and so on. Final thought, because I can see Heather sort of twitching like I'm talking for too long. Final thought is, I worry that no option is sustainable and stable, including actually the status quo if we weren't even in this situation in the first place. And if you have to remember how divided this country has now become, and how divided on attitudes towards EU institutions, attitudes towards free movement and migration, attitudes also that some of the issues I think across the EU and across other European countries become looking like increasingly unstable in terms of the future of the EU as well. And so whilst it feels that every option in the short term feels extremely difficult and unstable and potentially unsustainable, I think my kind of question is actually, where do we want to be in 10 years' time? And what kind of close relationship with Europe do we want? Because had we stayed in and had we won the referendum, actually I would have been arguing for reform from within, and I think we would have had to be arguing for reform from within. So if we want in 10 years' time to be in a close but different relationship, whether you've done that through staying in and reforming, as we'd argued for, or going out and then building the new relationship, either way, we still actually have to have a positive vision of what that new relationship is in 10 years' time that people can feel positive about, rather than just clinging on and thinking, let's just do damage limitation for what we've got. Yeah. And that, the really downside of that, of course, is there's an awful lot of people, both here at this conference and on the doorstep when you talk about it, who just say, do you know what, whatever happens on Brexit, I do just wish we could stop talking about it and start talking about something else. And actually, on this analysis, we're going to be talking about this, whatever happens, for the next 10 years. Thank you.
Lots of really interesting points there. I know I've got lots of questions, but I suspect you guys have even more questions. So let's throw it straight open. I don't know if they're all... Look, there's a lady with a mic. Lovely. Why don't we take this gentleman in the second row? Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name's Nick Crofts. I'm chair of Liverpool Labour Group. Welcome to Liverpool. Spend a few quid, please, whilst you're here. We need it. My question is around the parliamentary arithmetic. I think there is now a feasible pathway, largely due, Keir, to your intervention today, impromptu, that might mean there is an avenue to put the question again in the event of no deal or a deal that's rejected in Parliament, and that question can include, as you alluded to today, the possibility of Remain. But members of Parliament will have to vote in order for that to occur. I imagine the overwhelming majority of the Parliamentary Labour Party would support that, but we've still got to win the vote in Parliament, and I wonder what the panel's thoughts are about the number of Tory rebels and that might get us to that majority.
Can we take that one fairly briefly, perhaps? It's a maths question. How likely is it that anyone could win a vote in Parliament, do you think?
It's almost impossible to answer that. We've had, for the last 2 years, we've had Brexit legislation with amendments, which have cross-party support. And every time we get to a vote on them, we have lots of discussions about what the numbers are going to be, with lots of people saying, oh, there's this number of Tories going to vote for it, that number. And it never quite works out as you expect. Every now and again, you win one. On the meaningful vote, we won one in December of last year. But the number of times I've been promised that there's X number of people going to vote for this, and then as the clock ticks down to the division bell, those numbers fall away is countless. But it it does depend on the circumstances. If we're staring down the barrel of no deal, I honestly think that the majority in Parliament will want to do something about it. And the question then will be, what are we going to do about it? I honestly don't think that MPs, if the deal is voted down in November, are going to say, oh, well, we'll just sit here and brace ourselves for 4 months till we go over the cliff. That just isn't going to happen. The only winning combination in the end is if most of the PLP are in the same lobby. I spend most of my life trying to ensure that that happens. We've got 4 or 5 who simply won't and have never. I haven't voted with Kate Hoey in the same lobby for a very long time. But it does, and I think we need to get a sense of the situation we might be facing. If the deal has fallen or there is no deal, then I think there will be a very strong sense that we're in a crisis that needs careful management. You'll have seen what happens to the pound every time you think there's going to be a deal. You might imagine what would happen to it if it looks more likely that there's definitely going to be no deal. And so we're going to be in a very, very fluid situation, which is one of the reasons why our motion today looked at options, because we're going to have to be agile enough to deal with the situation as we find it.
Interesting. It's about those Tory rebels. I sometimes ban myself from using the phrase Tory rebels because they don't always actually rebel when it comes to it. Lady there?
Thank you. Carol Walker. I wonder if you accept that the stance that the party has adopted today, coupled with your assessment that any deal that Theresa May comes back with is unlikely to meet your tests, sends out the signal that we as a country have taken a significant step closer to another referendum, and that will only encourage the EU to play hardball.
Sort of one to Keir, but does anyone else want to?
I think it's probably
you go on. Sorry, Keir. Sorry, Keir. I should say I'm told John Lansman's on his way, so we can throw some tricky ones at him soon.
I'm intrigued by this argument because I've heard it at every twist and turn. So at the beginning of the exercise, and before Article 50 was issued, we said to the Prime Minister, you need a plan and you need to share it so we can see it. Even the high-level negotiating objectives. We were met with, oh, we can't do that. Absolutely can't do that. The moment we commit anything to writing, it'll be passed to the enemy. And an enemy was the name that the word that they used, and it'll undermine our very negotiating. And then we passed an opposition day motion and forced them to publish a plan, and they did it, and the sky didn't fall in. We then said, have you done any impact of your proposed course? David Davis, who at the time was feeling slightly hurt that people were suggesting he hadn't really done any work, said, yeah, we've done loads, we've filled rooms, endless detail of impact assessments, and conjured up the idea that there were roomfuls of stuff at Dexu. There was no element that hadn't been carefully done in a detailed way. So we said, well, can we have a look at it? Same response. If we give you anything about this impact assessment, it'll undermine the negotiations, it'll all go horribly wrong, it'd be the worst thing that we could do for the nation. At one stage, he said he couldn't even, at one stage I said, well, just tell us the headings, what sort of departments have you looked at? Well, agriculture, fisheries, I can't even do that. If we even tell you what we've been looking at, it will undermine the negotiations. Then we had a bit of fun with a humble address, which hours before we went to the vote, the Tories recognised was a binding vote, and the impact assessments had to be provided. When they were first provided, they said, well, we can't put it in the public domain. They had intense conversation with Hilary about the secrecy and protection of these documents. They were put in a secure room in the Treasury, and I had to go in and sort of hand in my phone, be searched and marched blindfold to a room so I'd never remember where they were, to be presented with the impact assessments, lest anybody saw them and it undermined the negotiations. We all went in to see them, and within weeks they were all on the internet. The world didn't fall in. So this idea that every twist and turn, that the moment we put down a challenge to the government, it is somehow a gift to the EU, I'm afraid is a bit worn out. And I would just add this. We're only in this position of having seriously to think about the position we find ourselves in because the negotiating strategy has utterly failed. Utterly failed. Why are we all now having to think, what on earth do we do to protect ourselves from no deal? And that is a complete failure of the negotiating strategy. So there's only one person to blame for the situation we find ourselves in, and that is the Prime Minister, because she's adopted a stance of the negotiation that has got us to this complete mess. And I don't think anybody is describing it as anything other than a mess. Nobody I've met, whichever way they voted, has said, yeah, this is exactly what I wanted. This is the sort of Britain I was looking for. Chaotic, no idea what the future holds, and everybody's scratching their head saying, I'm really anxious now about what's going to happen next. And so I think the idea that us sort of setting out in a logical sense how we would seek to protect our country from no deal somehow undermines the government, falls subject to the same problem as all the other times we've been told that if you ask us a question, you'll destroy the whole negotiations.
Yeah, can I just add
course,
to
yeah.
that? I agree with every single word. I just say when I first read those, not the impact assessments, I mean, you could have found it on the internet. And the reason I think it took them 3 weeks to produce them is because when the resolution was passed, they thought, blimey, we need to make it look like we have done some work. But, you know, the serious point behind all of this, and the only people who are responsible for the prospect of us facing a bad deal are the government. Let's be clear. But when I asked David Davis, when the Cabinet took the decision that we were leaving the customs union, did you undertake any economic assessment of what the impact would be on the British economy? And he looked me in the eye and he said, no. Well, exactly. I was, there are a number of things about Brexit that have astonished me, but that really did, because what an irresponsible thing to do when we are dealing with the greatest challenge we faced economically since the end of the Second World War. That has had huge implications for what's happened in the negotiations since, and the Cabinet just said, as a matter of ideology, rather than an assessment of whether it was in our economic interest, to decide that we were leaving the customs union come what may. And that is why we're in a mess.
Who's next? Gentleman right at the front here. Sorry, I've got you on the run there, haven't I?
Thank you. I'm Joss Gallagher. I'm a member of Labour International. Incidentally, I live in Brussels. So for me, Brexit is personal. It's not just business. A very simple question. It's very clear that the biggest obstacle to a withdrawal agreement is the Irish border. I think Hilary said that. And yet, if you think back 2 years ago, the one thing both sides agreed on was that there must be no border in Northern Ireland. So my question is this: how have we arrived at a position where the one thing everyone agreed on has become the one obstacle to agreement, which, if there is no agreement, means there will be a hard border in Ireland?
Yvette?
Yeah, I mean, I think the and we should continue with that clear view, which is that we should not have a hard border in Northern Ireland, and that the risks, including the security risks, are very significant in terms of the long term. That we had, advice from, Northern Ireland police chiefs and so on. I think in terms of how we have got to this from apparently best intentions, I think one of the significant things along the way on this was the government's ruling out of the customs union. and Theresa May's refusal to consider any form of customs union and to make that one of her red lines. And I think, you know, because of where the things debates all got to now and all the focus on checkers and so on, there has been, actually, people have sort of almost stopped debating the issue about customs union, but actually, I think, you know, both for the sake of the Northern Ireland border and for manufacturing across the country, it is a key component in this entire debate, and we should be, I think, talking up more the significance of a customs union. So I think that is partly why we have ended up you know, with this kind of impasse. It's not the whole reason, because there's lots of others as well, but it's partly why that we've had the impasse. And I think it's why, you know, look, Parliament, at the moment, Parliament, I think the focus has to be on the deal and on alternatives to the deal and on keeping the pressure up on the government about what kind of deal. And I think still calling for the customs union. That is the consequence of the referendum we had, and Parliament respecting the referendum is the first stage has to be concentrating on what best deal you could get for Britain, and then rather than, and not just sort of leap to the next stage, but actually to concentrate on the detail of that Northern Ireland border issue and things like a customs union as well.
Just to add to that, because it's a very, very good question. Both sides agree on the outcome. They're having an argument about the means. If you go back to paragraphs 49 and 50 of the joint report in December, in that week when the DUP said, whoa, we can't have this, and then they crafted a form of words that was able to get us through the door of the transition period and on to the next stage of the negotiations. It said that the UK will maintain full alignment in respect of the border. Now, when I read that, I thought, well, that's clear, the UK will maintain, so it's the whole of the UK. But the EU came back and said, no, 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 what that means is the UK as an institution will ensure full alignment, but the geographical coverage of the full alignment will be Northern Ireland only and not the whole of the UK. Now, I think that's I disagree with their interpretation of what that says, hence the standoff, which I referred to in my remarks at the beginning. The EU, in my view, will have to move on that question of the coverage of the commitment. But in order to do that, the government's got to come forward and complete its proposal on the fallback, which it originally published in June, part of it, and here we are getting towards the end of September. It still hasn't put forward the second bit, and they really need to get on and do that. But I think the EU, in what they've said recently, de-dramatise, look at the arrangements and so on, I think they now realise you can't end up with saying you're going to have to split your country down the middle, because it would be acceptable to nobody. And if they're going to argue, you can't mess with our single market, I think the UK is entirely within reason to say you're not messing with the integrity of our country. And therefore we have to find a deal that doesn't involve the separation out of Northern Ireland.
Keir, you want to come in?
Just briefly, it's got to do with blank paper and cans. The mistake, looking back on it, one of the big mistakes I think was made was the assumption that what was going to be written on the page headed the future relationship was blank to start with, that you could write on it what you liked as a wish list, and then you close your eyes, clench your fists, and it'll happen. And actually, the piece of paper headed the future relationship should have had other things written on it before anybody started the discussion about what the future relationship is. And it should have had, at the top, safeguarding the economy. So what are the bits that we need to preserve in order to safeguard the economy? And if it's manufacturing, the just-in-time model isn't an accident. That's developed because we've been in the customs union, the single market. The rapid transport of components over borders, the putting them together, and then rapid transport of finished goods back out again. That's the model we operate to because we've been in the customs union, the single market. And I don't think anybody voted in the referendum to say, why don't we rip that up, because we can. And equally, the service model developed because of the single market, the alignment, the regulatory framework. And again, I don't think anybody voted to say, let's rip that up because we can. So on that piece of paper should have been preserving our economic interests. And that gives you less space on the paper for what you want to do, but it's a perfectly sensible thing to take into account. The second thing on the paper should have been collaboration and cooperation in areas where we really need to. And Yvette's given a really good example of that. We collaborate on counter-terrorism work all the time. There's just an example. When I was Director of Public Prosecutions, I was the UK representative in Eurojust. And for those of you that don't know, you'll be reassured to know that at Eurojust, all 28 countries pool their intelligence. They look at where groups of individuals are engaged in very serious criminal activity, and they agree a strategy for intercepting them, arresting them, and prosecuting them. And you've got to do it all at the same time. If you're going to nab a terrorist cell, you have to get the second right across the continent. If you're going to do it in 4 countries, it has to be 6 a.m., 05, 014 seconds everywhere. Otherwise, it won't work. And that goes on, and it should go on. And I've not met anyone yet who says, please, can we get out of that arrangement? And therefore, the second thing on the blank piece of paper is where are the necessary areas where, OK, it reduces our flexibility for the deal we want, but at least it preserves the things that really matter for our country. And then the third thing should have been, should we just make a list of our existing commitments that we've got to keep? Because that may narrow the space for our wish list, but we can't just push them to one side. And the top of that list would have been the Good Friday Agreement, because we've already made a commitment to no hard border and to north-south cooperation. And they're solemn commitments that I genuinely think everybody wants to keep. There are 1 or 2 people in the House of Commons that are casual about it. The vast majority of MPs are not, and this Prime Minister is not. She's not. But that should have been on the piece of paper. So the room for manoeuvre in crafting what the future relationship should be was much smaller than the Prime Minister ever imagined. And if she'd started then, she'd have started with a smaller space, but she would have then had a more realistic assessment of what the future relationship should look like. And we're now stuck in this place because it was thought that you could simply write a wish list and say you could get it all without regard to that. I think it was a major mistake in retrospect. And then the more trivial point in a way is that part of the reason we're in this situation because things have been signed off along the way in the negotiations to get the can down the road. And there was a crisis before Christmas. The Prime Minister needed to get through that crisis, so she kicked the can down the road without working through everything that she was committing herself to. And she's done it every time. One thing she's good at is can kicking. She really is good at can kicking. And she does it well. Every time there's a line in the road, she flicks the can over it and lives, it's usually for another week. It's just, she's running out of road now. And is there going to be one last flick of the can somehow over another line? And if there is, it seems to me it'll be kicking it over to make the transition period actually a further negotiation period. And I can see that that might be the next trick she tries. But I think in truth, because of the division behind her, because she can't actually get agreement on a party, she's had to kick the can and hope for the best and live for another day.
Should we take a little cluster? I could see about 3 hands up here. Why don't we take, if we could sort of, there's a little sort of triangle of hands up there. There we go. And if we pass the mic between us, that'd be good.
Yeah, Roberto Stasi, Kensington CLP, and I'm also an activist for EU citizens' rights in the UK. 2 questions. The motion the conference approved today didn't mention the EU citizens' rights, so I would like to know if that was intentional or and what is the position of the Labour Party on this. Second question, in case of no deal, what is the position of the Labour Party for the European citizen? And what do you think about the settled status? And if the Labour government will retain the settled status scheme or propose something else?
Okay, good. That's a good clear question. Gentleman here.
Hello, Johnny, Edinburgh East CLP. I'm also quite active in the Young European movement and several other pro-European groups. Yeah, my question basically is, when I'm on the doorstep, when I'm out campaigning, I talk to constituents and I talk to voters and they say to me, okay, all this negative stuff if we get a Tory Brexit, what's the positive alternative that Labour is offering? Because as a veteran of the Scottish independence campaign, as a Remainer, one thing we often got accused of is just offering a negative alternative. People wanted a positive dream for the future that they could invest in. It's why people are still voting yes today. So I want to know from our wonderful panel, what positive dream for the future can I take back to Edinburgh?
Nice question. And here at the front.
Yeah. Hi, Mike Goldsworthy, Director of Scientists for EU. A question on sequencing. And that is, should we get to the stage where Parliament does reject any deal come back, or Parliament has had enough of no deal and says now is the time to pick a different course, there are two options going. One is the general election, the other is the people's vote, public vote, whatever you want to call it. It seems to be a default that Labour is saying we will go for a general election, and if we cannot get it, then the backstop is the people's vote, public vote. Is this the right way round to do it? Because it may just be that the government pick you up on the general election, in which case you need a manifesto offering. What is that offering going to be? Presumably it's going to be something like a soft Brexit with a promise of a people's vote at the end, a la Paul Mason, in order to try and satisfy everyone. You're squeezed into the middle from people calling betrayal on both sides. You win, and then you have to enact it and take all the blame for whatever happens with Brexit, with the Conservatives on the opposite bench screaming at you and very little domestic agenda being able to get through Parliament. Alternatively, if you were to have the people's vote first, then Parliament would have rejected the deal, the public could reject Brexit wholesale, the government will then not stand, as it has not got any more the DUP propping it up, and Labour can then say at this stage, here we come with our manifesto to fix all the things that the government have not fixed in the last 2.5 years with their wasted Brexit, and as soon as you come in, you can make positive agenda changes that are immediately felt.
Keir, Eh?
We're going to do a swap.
I'll be one in, one out. That's good. I know, Keir, you've got to go.
Shall I do a very quick blast?
Yes,
I'm really sorry
brilliant.
I've got to go, but I've got to go on to another
I don't want to ask you to revisit that
speaking
5-hour
event in just a
compositing
minute.
meeting. But
No, let me just maybe deal with Johnny's point and then answer the last point and leave the others for the panellists, if that's all right. What's the positive message? Well, first we've got to have an answer of what is the deal we want with the EU. And I've explained what I think the constraints on that are and what we ought to be trying to achieve. But I don't think that's going to be the Labour positive message. I think us going out of the doorstep saying, well, technically we've got a better answer on the customs union than they have, and a discussion on the doorsteps about, are you more a Norway kind of person or a Canada person, is going absolutely nowhere. What we've got to engage in is the bigger question of why did the phrase take back control have such resonance? Why was it such a Heineken phrase? And I think that millions of people were sending us a message about the state of politics and the state of the economy, and that there needed to be really big change. And I think that's something that's been going on for decades. And so I think that the positive message for Labour is that there are two pillars to Brexit. There is the deal with the EU, technical stuff, but there is the much bigger issue, which what's the deal for Britain that's going to transform Britain, deal with the inequality, which is hardwired in of every different sort, whether it's health inequality, education inequality, wealth inequality, regional inequality, and have a very radical transformational programme about how we're going to take up those issues and change it. And I think we would get a much better discussion if we were to say that is our vision of the future than we ever will by going and saying we want our customs union, not the customs union. You do know what we mean, don't you?
And just on that
I'm
sequencing
sorry, on
point,
the
because I know
sequencing-
sequencing is something you
No,
worked
it's
on quite a lot.
listen. It is really important that we have a general election to bring this government down. We are taking the most important decisions for decades, and we're sitting as the opposition, doing what we can to influence what happens. That is deeply frustrating, and in a time like this, when we are trying to craft what the future of our country is actually going to look like, you need a Labour government to do it. In particular, because that other side of Brexit, which in the end is the essential second part of the package, is not going to be delivered by this government. So the sequencing is absolutely right, and we should stick to it. And I'm really sorry that I've got to go.
That's quite all right. I can see most of his rucksack in there. I think that's a signal, isn't it? John, welcome.
Thank you. I'm sorry I'm late.
That's absolutely fine.
The NEC has just finished.
Okay, splendid. Did you want to set out so the very easy to answer question that we're all tackling is what will be the outcome of Brexit? And Yvette has already said that one answer is that we're going to be talking about it for the next 10 years, which is somewhat depressing for those of us who spend our lives writing about it. But did you want to sort of give us couple of minutes on where you think Labour is and what you think will happen next? Or would you like us to we're into questions so we can just press on with questions?
I don't mind if you're in questions and you feel you're in the right place, but I don't mind saying some stuff as well. So
should we give John a little... Go on.
Yeah, right, yeah, okay, well, look, let me say where... It's probably easy if I start saying where I am, and you know, I mean, look, it's on a personal level. I'm not speaking on behalf of anybody else, but on a personal level, I voted Remain. Haven't changed my mind. I was 2 weeks too young to vote in the previous referendum in 1975, but I actually would have voted. We didn't call it Remain then, but that's how I would have voted. Though I did go through what I might call a Bennite, no period, no reference to Hilary, but of scepticism, which I think finished in 1983. But I've always been very dissatisfied with debates about the EU, which I always feel are, or about Europe, which I always feel are too much about emotion and politics and not enough about economics. You know, I feel that was particularly true of the euro. Of discussions about the euro, which in Britain was about whether we should be in or out, as of course all of the debates about Europe are, rather than what kind of Europe we want and what role this might play in the economics of Europe. Although I think we made the right decision, it wasn't necessarily as a result of the quality of the debate. You know, where we are, I mean, I think that the EU is in need of radical reform. I think that the state we're in across Europe is not dissimilar from the state we're in Britain, which is, you know, austerity has failed us, neoliberalism has failed us, and actually we need an anti-austerity alternative programme for growth and jobs, sustainable growth and jobs, and to tackle climate change directly across Europe, not just in Britain, and that's true of whatever the result of this Brexit process is. I want to pay tribute to Keir. I'm sorry he's left because I think he's done a great job. You know, in his speech today, in the strategy of navigating a complex parliamentary process, which you know, I've never been close to, and so I don't understand as well as the other people here. And I think it is right to place winning an election, forcing an election, and in the hope of winning an election as the top priority for the outcome. But I think it's also right to keep all of the other options on the table. I'm actually grateful. I mean, I think the composite today was a largely unifying concept. I mean, I think we did see some of the cracks in the unity as well, but I think it was broadly in the debate, but it was broadly a unifying process, and I think unifying the party on this issue is important, just as the task of unifying the nation at the end of the process is important. And you know, you know, the referendum divided us in a way that was outside our control, and none of us wanted to be divided in that way. I'm very grateful that most people, at least, have, I think, stopped using Brexit as a stick to beat Jeremy Corbyn with. I think that was entirely counterproductive, in every iteration. And so it's good that it stopped, because I think we need to unite on this issue. Obviously the final decisions, we're nowhere near. We're still at the state of discussing hypotheticals until we get to the point where we fully understand what the so-called outcome is of, from the government, and understand the exact, context, parliamentary context, because that's important. I think it's important at that stage for the whole party to be involved in decision-making at crucial stages, at a later stage. Momentum is consulting. We didn't do it before the conference, but we are doing it after the conference, consulting our members in order not to create headlines about which way Momentum thinks on a particular issue. I think creating headlines is not a particularly helpful purpose of that exercise. What we want to do is to actually understand what our members think, so that we can actually make decisions about the way we would advise our about our campaigning priorities, because we want to influence the outcome in the right direction. But to do that, we have to understand our members' decisions. And to underline, why I think it's important that we should have now some understanding of the process by which the party can influence, and I mean the whole party can influence decisions at crucial stages. I'd make reference to another time of an absolutely critical decision about the future of Europe, when we had actually a party conference to make a decision from which Attlee walked across Parliament Square in order to report that the Labour Party conference had agreed to the declaration of war in 1939. Now, if you can have a party conference to make a decision of such great importance at such a difficult time, I think that in an internet age we can develop ways of involving the party's membership and affiliates in decision making when we get to crucial times. So that's how I see things.
And when you say crucial, very useful. When you say crucial time, do you mean, for example, what Labour does on the vote in Parliament when that deal comes back in November or whenever it might be?
I don't actually think that's the crucial stage, right, because I think Keir has been very clear about that. I think the six tests are pretty clear about that. I think we should be voting against. We should be voting
assuming
against.
Assuming the deal is as we expect.
Yeah. I mean, we should. We're not going to get a deal from the Tories which meets our six tests, because it's not going to be anything like as worker friendly as what we would do, and there are going to be all sorts of things wrong with it. So I cannot envisage a situation where we would do anything other. I'm convinced that we will do nothing other than vote against any Tory deal or absence of deal that the Tories bring back. It's at later stages, I think then it's clear that we try and force a general election, because the Tories have failed their responsibility as the government to deliver a sane outcome through the Brexit negotiations, and we should have the right to do so. But if we fail on that, because that's what I see as the order of priorities, then other options should be considered depending on the circumstances of the time, including a vote. I don't want, actually the branding of that vote is, I don't want to get kind of bogged down in, but there needs to be a public vote on, or that's one of the options, and that does need to be considered.
Okay. I was just going to say, we left a question hanging.
We did on
didn't we? I'm sorry about that.
And my apologies, because I too have to go when I've answered your question. But you raised the question of citizens' rights. Now, we've had a very clear position that EU citizens here should remain and have their rights protected. That is part of the agreement. There's been obviously scepticism about how the new settled status process will work. But there is a relatively simple system, but we will see how the Home Office operates it. I think I would say this, heaven forbid if we were to end up with no deal, I do think that there is a moral and a political obligation on both parties in this negotiation, the UK and the EU, in that eventuality to at the very least ring-fence a legal commitment to EU citizens and Brits abroad. We must remember the 1.2 million Brits who have exercised their free movement rights, because I think anything other than that would be unconscionable, because this is about people's lives. And they moved their families, and they have had a life and contributed based on what they thought the rules were. We've decided to change them. We must make sure that we guarantee their position. And Labour has been foursquare behind that from the very, very beginning. Indeed, and my final point, the only report that the Brexit Select Committee has managed to agree unanimously was the one in which we early on called on the British government to give a unilateral commitment to EU citizens in the UK that they could remain. So that, I think, shows how it cut across everybody's position.
Just forgive me. Absolutely. We're operating a kind of tag team panel here. Should we say thank you to Hilary?
Please
quite important to add on the citizens' rights issue, because I think this is immensely important to people. To be fair to the government, they've made this commitment now that, you know, rights will be respected regardless of what happens, and even in a no-deal situation. There is one issue, however, that I think they are not going strongly enough, but this is something that the EU has signed up to as well as the UK, which is that the rights in future for EU citizens will be dependent on having signed up to the registration scheme, settled status scheme, you know, and so on. And so therefore your rights depend on you having gone through a process. Now, as we know from Windrush, there are some people who, for whatever reason, don't go through a process, and that might be because they are children who don't know that they are not UK citizens. It might be, and then they pass 18 and suddenly discover they're not entitled to their student loans or whatever it might be. There are might be older people, vulnerable people, people who have learning difficulties, all sorts of reasons why people might not be aware, or people might just assume that they have rights already and don't register. So I think actually there would be a responsibility, and both the UK and the EU should do this, is to make your rights guaranteed actually on your previous history and status. So if you have been here more than a certain number of years, those rights are guaranteed regardless of whether or not you've filled in the right form or not by a certain deadline. I think that's incredibly important.
Host privileged, Charles, do you want to ask one? And then there's an incredibly patient man in a stripy t-shirt over there whose question we must take next.
I had a question for
very
Hilary,
persistent.
but he's
Oh,
got
dear.
something very important he said, but I'll try and suggest what an answer might be. He says something very important, is that the EU has to shift. He said his select committee in Parliament would not pass a backstop on the basis that the EU has proposed it. Even he implied a kind of modified backstop. So the question is, what should the EU do? What modification should it make? And my answer would be, the EU will only move a bit if the UK moves on its side. Where the EU has to move is accepting some element of the common rule book that was in the Chequers plan, which the EU has rejected. But my information is one of the reasons the EU's rejected it is because the governance arrangements, the role of the Court of Justice, the commitment to update environmental and social rules, guarantees that the UK won't undermine the level playing field, was not sufficient for the EU's point of view. So if the UK came back with a better offer on the single market in goods, if it also said we will stay in a customs union, which is, as Yvette said, is absolutely crucial, then I can't guarantee this. I think the EU would engage more than it has engaged now, and then it might be prepared to look for a way forward. Because frankly, there has to be some sort of border across the Irish Sea, unless you eliminate the need for customs controls between Northern Ireland and the UK. And you can only do that if you have a customs union and you have some sort of UK staying in the single market for goods and farm goods. That's my view, but the panel may have, Yvette might have her own views on that. I think the EU has to move, but it won't move unless the UK moves first.
Sounding more like an answer than a question, Charles. I think we've all... So we'll take a gentleman over there, and then there's a lady in the middle as well. Shall we?
Hello. I've changed my question after John Lansman said that this afternoon he thought brought unity and clarity to our position. Now, Keir Starmer said to great applause and standing ovation that we'll keep the option of a people's vote and an option to have Remain on the ballot. Overwhelmingly supported. We've had John McDonnell saying that it will be a choice between the deals, and we've had the Assistant General Secretary of the Unite saying the same thing this afternoon. So I'm sorry, we and people I'm communicated, friends and family, certainly aren't clear as to what Labour Party's policy is on those questions. Perhaps you could help clarify.
Okay, should we take the woman in the middle as well, and then we'll sort of bundle them all up together?
Hi, I'm kind of mindful of the fact that whatever happens is going to happen soon, whether that's a general election or a people's vote. The Scottish referendum had an 18-month run-in, and mistakes were made in the first referendum in terms of the messaging that we as a party managed to put out there. And so I'm worried that we are ill-prepared to make the case, and if we as a party intend to make the case, You know, Momentum, for instance, has a very powerful and effective social media network. Is that going to get behind a Remain idea? Is the Labour Party, the leadership and the shadow cabinet going to go out and make the case to people in Stoke? Are we now going, and if so, are we going to start doing that now? Because the clock is ticking. 6 months is already brief. This is all very dry and difficult for me to understand. So it's not a message that we can take to the country. Are we formulating that message?
Interesting. Who wants to go first? Yvette, do you want to?
Yeah, I think starting with Charles' question, I agree that I think, to me, from the outside, it looks like there is scope for the EU to shift its position. It absolutely has to have a position. Effectively, the EU seems to be saying, okay, you can have Norway or you can have Canada and split up your country. And the idea that that's a sustainable position for the EU as part of the negotiations just does feel ludicrous to me. And it feels like they are going to have to shift their position, but and that's why I kind of go back to the point I raised about why we're in this situation around the Northern Ireland border in the first place. The government's red line around the customs union seems to me to be what the EU can then use as their excuse for not shifting position, because they say, look, you've got a red line on that, so how can we engage with you around customs union and so on? So that does mean you have to give on both sides. You know, deal with this issue about the lack of clarity. I mean, look, to be honest, I'm not involved in any of these discussions, so, you know, whether it's been the, you know, mammoth compositing session or some of the discussions that have been happening in the Shadow Cabinet or in Momentum and so on. But just, again, just looking at all this, I think, you know, we just can't, any of us, expect absolute clarity on what's going to happen when there is so much confusion and chaos about what's going on, and where we don't know what the government is going to come back with. We don't know whether the government is even going to still be standing by the end of the week in which they put something forward, or whether it'll be a different Prime Minister suddenly stepping in to try and do things. We don't know whether there'll be any indication that actually there's an alternative version of what's come forward that might be better or that might get more support in Parliament. We don't know what the numbers are going to be. And that, I think, also goes back to, I think, the question that we had in the front here as well. I think if anybody thinks there is a simple route down any of these tracks, unfortunately, I wish there was, because that would be lovely, but I just don't feel like there is, and therefore. So I think the clearest you can get is to say all options should be on the table, and that therefore, you know, in those circumstances, Parliament is going to have to respond. And it goes back to what I said before. I think Parliament's first focus has to be on the deal and trying to get the best deal that follows on from the referendum that we had and the public vote that we had. Once you then get to that stage, okay, whether the vote, and I think your question was what happens if that is then voted down. So you then end up with some really puzzling questions about, are you asking Parliament to put something that Parliament has rejected to the public in a referendum? Well, that also raises some quite difficult questions in all of that. So that's why you do, I think, have to just recognise this is uncharted territory. This is none of us have any experience of what this is like, and it is at a time when, as well, we have a hung Parliament, and so it's going to be a difficult thing to respond to. The one thing I think Parliament absolutely has to make sure, and categorically, and I think that was a clear bit, I think, of the motion, was to stop no deal. And I think that is a huge responsibility. I do think that Parliament will figure that that is just too irresponsible, but there is something, you could end up here potentially in another kind of constitutional crisis here, because if the government tries to put a gun to Parliament's head, if the executive tries to put a gun to Parliament's head to say it's our deal or no deal, and you can't have anything else, and if you reject our deal, then we will go down the track of no deal, when that's clearly not the only option, when you can talk about extending Article 50, when you can talk about all sorts of different other options, and Parliament itself has to be sovereign in those circumstances. If, because there is no
clear statutory route to block Article 50 because the government has control about what votes are put to Parliament and what legislation is put to Parliament. We may end up in a situation where a vote or amendments that are put from Parliament might end up not having statutory force. They might just be effectively motions to take note. It would be possible legally for the executive to ignore a motion like that because it doesn't have statutory force. But that would create, I think, a huge constitutional crisis in terms of the relationship between the executive and Parliament as well. But again, as I said, all of this is uncharted territory. And then I think the final question about, in the end, I suppose this sort of goes back to, look, this broader question of, I think the country is as divided as ever. And I think, I'm afraid, to me, it feels like people, depending on what side they started on the Remain Leave argument, are just still talking to each other. And actually, there is very little of people talking to each other across that Remain Leave divide. And to me, it feels like, there are people who are frankly fed up of the whole subject on both sides of the argument now. But we're still ending up almost in danger of reinforcing these divisions, getting stuck in exactly the same divisions for the next 10 years. And if we don't start to think not just about, and I spent most of this conference going on about cities and towns and lots and lots of fringe meetings because I think there's some deep economic divides going on between cities and towns, and some of which I think underpins the Brexit vote as part of wider inequalities and so on. So, but not just about dealing with those causes, but also dealing with the honest arguments about recognising actually people were also saying they were fed up with the arrangements with the EU. And that hasn't really been talked about by anybody. So I think but that comes back to my final point. You, I think, asked a question earlier on about positive vision. And all right, when I talked about 10 years, maybe that sounds like too far for people to think about, when we'll start struggling to worry about what's going to happen in the next 10 days or the next 23 days before the next summit. So maybe then pitch it at 5 years, if you like. But I think if we don't come up with a positive vision of not just a positive vision of the kind of country we want to be, but a positive vision of what we see as being our relationship with other countries in the world, if it's always seen as a damage limitation, a negative thing, actually we will end up going around this kind of vortex for a very long time. I still think it's a reformed future relationship, whatever it might be. Going back to the status quo, I don't think will ever be seen as a positive vision, but you've still got to think, for the long term, whatever our route and our bumpy road along the meantime, if we can't articulate a positive internationalist vision, who are we? We're the Labour Party. We should be able to come up with a positive internationalist vision.
John, is Labour as united as you suggested?
Well, I think it is actually, but there clearly are still a range of opinions, and I actually agreed with an awful lot of what Yvette said. About clarity, I agree about cities and towns, and I agree about the positive vision. I mean, I think the thing about constructive ambiguity is you need that. You need ambiguity in order to achieve unity. You need it in order that MPs, are able to, how shall I put it, tailor the message in order to to meet the issues in their own constituencies, it's actually to lead Labour MPs through the right division at the right times. Does require them to be able to tailor to be using different messaging in their own in different constituencies, and so you need ambiguity. Clarity. We might all like clarity, but actually it's not constructive in this process. I suspect that when people complain about the lack of clarity, what's really going on is there's a lack of trust, and we know that there needs to be some trust building in the Labour Party, I think there are ways of doing that. I'm not sure we're doing all of those ways yet. I think that we are still at the stage where there are just too many hypotheticals, and in order to achieve clarity, you need those hypotheticals need to turn into realities, So on one other thing that Yvette said, I agree that that the country is still very divided, just as divided as it was. But I think there has also been quite a bit of churn. I think there are, and churn actually in both directions. And it's different in different places. And I don't know how much, this isn't my day job. I don't study the data, as closely as I'm sure some others here do. But I don't know how much understanding there is of that, but I'm talking about my own experience of talking to people. I talk to so many people, who have shifted from in both directions. So I think that has to be a reality in the world outside, as well as in the various bubbles in which we operate.
We should say, in response to the woman's question about is Labour ready to get out there and fight for Remain, the position that's been agreed is quite a long way from that, isn't it? We're a long way off that point.
Well, we are a long way off, but there has been some shift. The range of ambiguity has shifted, and it's shifted today. And I think people recognise that. And actually a lot of people have gone on a journey during the course of this debate, and actually a lot of people will continue to go on a further journey as the hypotheticals turn into realities.
I think that's quite a good note to wind up, but given that I could imagine my stomach's rumbling, so I can imagine everybody else's probably is too. But I think we've all agreed that the answer to the question what will be the outcome of Brexit is goodness knows, and I think we're all agreed that it's going to be a very, very interesting few weeks and months, and that we're going to be talking about this for a very long time to come. So perhaps we could thank what's left of our panel, John Lansman and Yvette Keir.